CEO was about to sign the divorce, but she asked for one last night and revealed the shocking secret. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Sophie opened her eyes to the sound of steady raindrops pattering against the window. She hadn't managed more than a few hours of restless sleep, and a dull ache settled behind her temples as she sat up. The morning light was weak and gray, made paler by the storm clouds overhead, and it seemed almost too fitting for the day that lay ahead. She dragged herself out of bed, catching a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was slightly matted on one side, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story of months of tension and silent tears. She went through the motions of brewing coffee, though she wasn't sure her uneasy stomach could handle it. Leaning against the kitchen counter, she tried to steady her racing thoughts. The divorce papers were already neatly stacked on the table, along with a pen and a small notepad where she used to scribble grocery lists and cheerful reminders for Daniel. She turned her gaze away quickly. If she allowed herself to dwell on every memory, she wasn't sure she'd manage to step out the door. The raindrops turned into a heavier drizzle. Sophie sighed, took a few tentative sips from her mug, and felt her stomach twist. She set the coffee aside and pressed a hand to her abdomen, surprised by how queasy she felt again this morning. It wasn't the first time that week. The unease had started as light nausea, but each day it grew more persistent. Her mind was so occupied with the divorce that she hadn't taken it seriously at first. Yet something in her heart told her there was more than just stress to blame. A faint memory of better times surfaced. She remembered her second year of marriage with Daniel, when a lazy Sunday morning meant a walk in the park, the two of them giggling over nothing. Back then, their arguments were small and easily resolved, usually over things like which movie to watch or what takeout to order. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when minor disagreements evolved into raging fights about money, relatives, and the relentless demands of Daniel's position as CEO. Everything now felt heavier, suffocating. At first, she had tried so hard to be supportive. She wanted to see him succeed, believed wholeheartedly in his ambition. But somewhere in the whirlwind of investor meetings and late-night stress calls, they had both lost sight of each other. Shaking off the memories, Sophie went to her closet to find something professional yet comfortable to wear to the courthouse. She chose a simple black dress and a light cardigan, checking her reflection one more time. The morning was pressing on, and she needed to face it. The thought made her chest tighten, but she told herself she had no choice. It was either sign the papers and end the dragging cycle of arguments, or remain stuck in a painful limbo that benefited no one. Before heading out, Sophie pulled out her phone. The screen showed a missed text from her best friend Elena, asking if she was okay. She considered replying with a short reassurance, but decided she didn't have the energy. She slipped the phone into her purse and made her way to the door. The cool morning air and the soft mist of rain hit her face as she walked to her car. The sky looked like it might unleash a proper storm any moment. Pushing aside a surge of nerves, Sophie started the engine. Just as she was about to pull out, her phone rang. She switched the car off and answered, noticing it was her doctor's office. The conversation was brief. They'd received some preliminary results from the blood work they had done a few days ago. The nurse's tone was calm, but she asked if Sophie could come in soon. A wave of apprehension coursed through her. After a moment's hesitation, Sophie agreed to stop by before the courthouse. The drive through wet streets forced her to maintain a cautious speed. Rain spattered her windshield, the rhythmic swish of the wipers mingling with her pounding heart. She gripped the steering wheel, trying to push aside worst-case scenarios. Maybe it was just a routine call. Maybe they'd found something minor like a vitamin deficiency. Yet her gut feeling told her otherwise. When she arrived at the doctor's office, Sophie dashed through the drizzle, umbrella clutched tightly. Inside, the waiting room was quiet, the walls a soft beige that did little to calm her nerves. She forced a polite smile at the receptionist and took a seat. Within minutes, a nurse escorted her to a small examination room. The doctor greeted her warmly, flipping through notes on a clipboard. She asked Sophie about her symptoms: fatigue, queasiness, occasional dizziness. Sophie watched the doctor's expression carefully. There was concern there, but nothing too alarming, at least not yet. The doctor explained they wanted to double-check some levels, run a few more precise tests, and confirm a suspicion. She hinted that it could be something that would change Sophie's life plan if the results came back in a particular way, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions until the laboratory verified everything. Sophie's stomach knotted tighter. Still, there was no time to dwell on it. Her appointment at the courthouse loomed close. Promising Sophie a phone call within a few hours, the doctor urged her to try and rest. Sophie nodded mutely, though the idea of rest felt impossible. On her way out, she caught a reflection of herself in a glass door. Shoulders tense, eyes slightly wide. She wanted to shake that woman in the reflection and say, "Calm down, you can handle this," but she just hurried back out into the rain. Traffic was heavier now, and Sophie tapped her fingers anxiously on the steering wheel at every red light. Her phone buzzed with another message, likely Elena again, but she kept her focus on navigating the slick roads. When she finally arrived at the courthouse, she felt drained, as though she'd run a mental marathon. She parked close by, noticing Daniel's sleek, familiar car a few spaces away. Her breath caught in her throat. Seeing it reminded her again how real this day was. Umbrella held firmly above her. She crossed to the courthouse steps. The gray stone building towered over the street, imposing and unforgiving. The official sign near the entrance glistened with raindrops. Inside, the lighting was fluorescent, and the tiled floors squeaked under wet shoes. She saw Daniel standing near a large window in the hallway, scrolling through his phone. His posture was stiff, jaw set, the picture of someone who had everything under control. But Sophie knew that stance. Underneath the sharp suit and crisp shirt, he was just as troubled as she was, maybe in denial, maybe consumed by his own regrets. He looked up and met her gaze. No warm greeting. His eyes flickered with a mix of frustration and something else she couldn't read. She shut her umbrella and placed it aside, trying to steady herself. Then she walked over, her heels echoing on the tiles. "You're late," Daniel said bluntly, slipping his phone into his suit pocket. She swallowed hard, refusing to let anger overtake her. There was no point in hurling accusations about the thousands of times he'd been late himself, to dinner, to her birthday celebrations, because all that belonged to the past. They were moments away from discarding. "Traffic," she replied, her tone subdued. "And I had an appointment." He nodded but didn't push for details. That single gesture of aloof politeness twisted her insides. They used to share everything, from silly daily updates to heartfelt confessions. Now the silence between them felt like an unbridgeable gulf. A clerk with a stack of papers passed by and told them the judge's assistant would call them shortly. Sophie shifted her weight from one foot to the other, glancing around the hallway. The air smelled of old paper and damp jackets. Lawyers and clients shuffled back and forth, each lost in their own legal battles. She felt small amid the swirl of tension. Daniel broke the silence in a low voice. "We should get this over with. I have another meeting after." She suppressed the urge to snap. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief second, remembering the call from her doctor and how it might be something far more important than any business deal. "Daniel," she began carefully, "I think—" He cut in, impatience lacing his words. "Can we not, Sophie? Let's get through the signing. Whatever you need to say can wait, right?" A spark of anger flared up in her chest. She clenched her fists at her sides. For months, she had let him rush her emotions. She had allowed him to overshadow their problems with his constant obligations. But not today. She swallowed, gathering the last scraps of composure she had left. "Daniel, I need you to listen," she said, voice low but firm. "This isn't just another fight." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Then what is it?" Her heart pounded so fiercely she wondered if he could hear it. She glanced at the closed courtroom doors, hearing muffled voices inside. Everything in her life felt suspended in that moment, and the gravity of what she was about to say made her hands shake. For a second, she questioned herself. Was this truly the right time and place? But the words were right there on her tongue, waiting to change their lives. Her lungs felt tight as she inhaled, summoning courage from some hidden place. She met his stare head-on, seeing the chill in his gaze that masked old warmth. 1,000 memories flashed through her mind. Their first dance at the wedding, how he'd held her so protectively, the time he'd surprised her with a trip to the mountains. She swallowed back the ache. Sophie draws in a shaky breath, meeting Daniel's cold gaze. I have something to tell you, something that changes everything. Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard Sophie correctly. The words were still hanging in the tense courthouse hallway air. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his expression tightening with impatience. The overhead lights cast a chilly glow on the polished floor, and nearby voices rose and fell in echoes, reminding them they weren't alone here. Say that again? He asked quietly, as if hoping she would change her answer. Sophie's throat felt dry. Adrenaline coursed through her body, but she held Daniel's gaze. I said I think I'm pregnant, she repeated, voice trembling at the edges. I'm sorry if this is sudden, but it's not a trick. It's just the truth. For a moment, neither spoke. The faint hum of a vending machine buzzed from a corner, underscoring the stillness between them. Sophie could practically see the disbelief unfold behind Daniel's eyes. He exhaled, glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. The tension was like a cord pulled too tight, ready to snap at any second. Pregnant, he echoed, voice hollow. Right when we're about to finalize, he stopped, pressing his lips into a hard line. You expect me to think this is just a coincidence? She bristled but kept her composure. I didn't plan it. I'm as shocked as you are. His silence pushed her to continue. I've been feeling ill for a while, and I thought it was just stress. This morning my doctor hinted there might be another reason. Her eyes flickered with a mix of anxiety and a faint hope she was trying desperately to hide. Daniel raked a hand through his hair. You're telling me this right before we sign the papers? You couldn't have mentioned it sooner? She felt her frustration welling. I wasn't sure until today. Do you know how terrified I've been, wondering if it's even real? Wondering how you'd react if it was? Before Daniel could respond, a young clerk appeared from around the corner, her clipboard in hand. She scanned the waiting area, oblivious to the tension. Mr. and Mrs. Coleman, the judge's assistant wants to speak with you. We're running a bit behind schedule, so you might have another 20 minutes or so. Sophie nodded stiffly and offered the clerk a polite smile, then turned back to Daniel as the woman walked away. His shoulders were set rigid, and his gaze had drifted to the floor. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he cleared his throat. Fine, he said. 20 minutes. She knew he was in shock, perhaps even angry, but at least they had this brief window to talk before being called in. Sophie reached out to touch his arm, but he stepped back almost imperceptibly. The rejection stung. Her vision blurred for a beat, though she blinked back tears, determined not to let her emotions control the moment. They found a quieter corner, away from the traffic of lawyers and clients rushing past. A wide window overlooked a small, rain-lashed courtyard. The gray clouds hung low and heavy, as though they too carried the weight of unspoken truths. Sophie glanced through the glass at the slick pavement, trying to gather courage. What do we do now? She asked softly. I mean, if I am pregnant, this divorce, it doesn't change that we're broken, Daniel said, though his tone faltered with each word. We've been fighting like this for months, Sophie. You know it. She swallowed, a sharp pang in her chest. I know we're in a bad place, she replied, voice thick. But maybe this is a sign that we should try to fix things. He gave a short, humorless laugh. We can't just rely on a baby, assuming it's even true, to magically solve our problems. There's too much resentment, Too many lies. His eyes flickered to the side. And if the press catches wind of this, my family would be all over it. The board, too. She felt anger flare up. This isn't about your precious board. You're not the only one involved. You think I enjoy this? Standing in a courthouse about to sign papers that end everything we built together? Something in Daniel's expression shifted. He glanced at her belly, as if seeing it differently for the first time, then looked away. The strain in his features revealed the conflict he was fighting, between the life he had with Sophie and the life he was trying to control at the office. Look, she continued, calmer now. All I know is there's a chance, maybe a big chance, that I'm carrying your child. I'd never use that to force you into staying with me if you truly don't want to. She twisted a ring on her finger, remembering for a second the day Daniel placed a wedding band there. But you deserve to know. That's all. He sighed, and for an instant, Sophie thought she saw regret cross his face, but he squared his shoulders and avoided her eyes. We'll find out for sure, one way or another, he said quietly. Until then, maybe it's best we don't do anything rash. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Like sign the divorce papers? He nodded almost reluctantly. We could ask for a postponement, at least until we know if... He cut off mid-sentence when he spotted a figure stepping into the hallway. It was the judge's assistant again, beckoning them with a polite wave. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. She steeled herself, smoothing down the front of her dress and motioning Daniel to follow. Walking down the hall, they exchanged glances that held 1,000 unspoken questions. Despite the tension, an air of uncertainty bound them. For all the anger that had led them to this point, the possibility of a pregnancy made it impossible to finalize things with a clear conscience. The assistant directed them toward the judge's office. Once there, they learned the court schedule was overflowing. The judge agreed to postpone any final decision until they resolved this sudden development. They were given a short extension to confirm the pregnancy, after which they'd need to return with a definitive answer about how to proceed. By the time they left the courthouse, the rain had stopped, though the sky remained overcast. They stood awkwardly by the entrance, footsteps echoing on the damp steps. I guess we should keep in touch, Daniel muttered. Let me know what the doctor says. Sophie exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. I will. I have to go home and try to calm down. They parted, Daniel striding quickly to his car, eyes fixed on some distant point. Sophie watched him drive off with a tightening in her chest. She found her own vehicle and sank into the driver's seat, mind swirling. The thought of possibly bringing a child into this fractured marriage was daunting enough without the added fear of doing it alone. She started the ignition and pulled onto the main road, heading back to the small apartment she had moved into after the separation became inevitable. Traffic was mercifully light. Still, her nerves were wound so tightly that every honking horn felt like a blow to her already frazzled senses. As she neared her building, a call lit up her phone screen, the number for the medical office. Her pulse quickened. She parked near the curb and answered with a hesitant, "Hello?" Her doctor's voice was calm but direct. She had the results from the more detailed blood tests. Sophie felt her body tense, bracing for what might come next. The words that followed left her so stunned she could hardly think. A chill shot down her spine as the doctor carefully explained the findings, repeating certain details to make sure Sophie understood. By the end, Sophie's eyes were wide, and her lips parted in shock. She managed a shaky thank you, hung up, and just sat there in her car, staring at the familiar street outside. Water from the recent rain glistened on the asphalt, and the clouds above seemed to close in, as if pressing down with the weight of her new reality. Twin heartbeats. 2 babies. Suddenly, every doubt, every piece of heartbreak, and every fear magnified tenfold. Slowly, she stepped out of the car and trudged upstairs. The building's hallway lights buzzed overhead, almost flickering in tune with her racing thoughts. Inside her apartment, she sank onto the couch, phone still clutched in her hand. She could barely breathe. She glanced at the time, late afternoon, though the sun barely peeked through the dense clouds. Her mind reeled with the words the doctor had used. Definitely pregnant, high hormone levels, possibility of needing specialized care for multiple births. Sophie tried to picture telling Daniel. How would he react to the news that it wasn't just one baby, but two? A wave of dizziness overcame her, and she set her phone aside, leaning her head back. She closed her eyes, only to see a mental image of Daniel's face, caught in that moment of shock when she'd said she might be pregnant. Now, the truth was so much bigger. No matter how deep their problems ran, it wasn't just about them anymore. Her phone buzzed again, likely messages from her best friend or maybe another call from the doctor's office. She picked it up slowly, swallowing hard. As she stared at the screen, the reality of it all hit with full force. Sophie, phone in hand, whispers in disbelief, "Twins?" She looks out the window into the dim afternoon light, mind whirling with the new reality. The phone wouldn't stop ringing, though Sophie hesitated to pick up. She had the news to share, yet she wasn't sure she had the courage for the inevitable conversation. Still, when Daniel's name flashed on the screen, she knew there was no avoiding it. She drew in a steadying breath and answered. "Hi," she said, voice trembling. His tone came through tight and impatient. "I've been waiting to hear from you. Did you speak to the doctor? What's going on?" Her gaze flicked across the living room. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest. I did," she began. "They confirmed we're having twins." Silence filled the line, pressing down harder than any words could. Sophie anxiously rubbed her temple. "Daniel, are you there?" It took him a moment, but he finally exhaled. "Twins," he repeated in a near whisper. He coughed as though clearing his throat. I wasn't expecting that." She heard the background sounds of a parking garage, muffled engines, footsteps echoing. "All right, listen," he went on, sounding more composed, but no less strained. "We'll figure out what to do. I'm late for a meeting. I'll call you when I'm done." Before she could reply, the call ended. Sophie's grip tightened on the phone. The finality of his abrupt goodbye stung, but she didn't have the energy to be angry. "He's in shock," she told herself, pressing a hand to her abdomen. She could barely process the idea of two babies herself. Daniel sat in his car for a moment, staring unseeingly at the steering wheel. The phone sat beside him on the passenger seat, screen dark. He repeated Sophie's words in his head. "We're having twins." The morning that was already spinning out of control just veered into uncharted territory. Outside his windshield, downtown traffic bustled by, but he hardly noticed. Then a sharp vibration on his phone startled him. His office assistant had sent 3 messages. Urgent board meeting. Important investors on the line. No more delays. He started the engine and navigated out of the parking lot, trying to suppress the swarm of thoughts careening through his mind. By the time he reached the office, the tension in his shoulders had knotted into a dull ache. He faked a brisk confidence while stepping into the elevator with colleagues, exchanging stiff nods but avoiding any small talk. In the boardroom, a row of suited individuals awaited him, each with grave expressions. The meeting commenced immediately, launching into talk of shaky contracts and ongoing negotiations with a vital investor. Daniel tried to focus on the data projected on the screen, charts and graphs about profit margins, cost overruns, projections for the next quarter, but his mind drifted to Sophie, to those 2 lives growing inside her. Soon he found himself dialed into a conference call with key investors. Their voices crackled over the speaker, questioning the company's stability. Hints about Daniel's personal life surfaced between the lines, subtle references to recent distractions. He forced polite replies. Each time he heard mention of potential scandal, he pictured the tension in Sophie's eyes, the heartbreak that had fueled their separation, and now the possibility that everything could shift again. After the call wrapped, he pressed his forehead into his palm, stifling the urge to curse the universe for piling crisis upon crisis. Meanwhile, Sophie paced her small living room, hardly noticing the afternoon light filtering through the blinds. She'd placed a hand on her stomach more than once, startled by the realization that 2 babies were growing inside her. She thought about Daniel's abrupt reaction. Had he even grasped the gravity of the news? A part of her feared that a fractured marriage would only worsen if they forced themselves to stay together solely because of the twins. The jangle of keys rattled at the front door. Her friend, Elena, slipped in, balancing a paper grocery bag in one arm. "I tried calling, but you didn't pick up," Elena said, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Brought you something to eat. Are you okay?" Sophie smiled gratefully, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks. My stomach's all over the place. I don't know how I'm supposed to manage without losing my mind." Elena nodded sympathetically as she unpacked the groceries. "You said the doctor confirmed twins? That's big news, Soph. How are you handling it?" Concern laced her voice. Sophie sighed, sinking into the couch. "I can't believe it. After everything, Daniel and I were about to sign the divorce papers. Now this happens." And his reaction was, "I don't even know." Elena set down a carton of juice and walked over, resting a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder. "You need support right now, no question about it. Have you spoken to your parents?" Sophie made a face. "Mom called this morning. She wants me to come over tonight, and she wants Daniel there too. I guess she's worried, especially since I'll be raising 2 babies, possibly alone. And you know how they feel about him. They think his job is taking priority over everything else." Elena nodded slowly. "Maybe it'll help to clear the air. Just be cautious. Your stress levels don't need to spike more than they already have." She gave Sophie's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I'll stay if you need me, or I can drive you to your parents. Whatever feels best." Sophie managed a small smile. "Thank you, but I have to face them eventually. And so does Daniel. I just hope it doesn't turn into a screaming match." Later that evening, Daniel's phone buzzed yet again, but this time it was his father's number. He stood near his office window, the skyline turning orange under the sunset. A part of him wanted to ignore the call, but he grudgingly picked up. "Your mother and I heard about the hearing's delay," his father began without preamble, "and now we're hearing rumors that Sophie might be pregnant. Is that true?" Daniel exhaled, not surprised that word had spread so quickly among family. "Yes, it's true. We're having twins." Silence on the other end. Finally, his father spoke in that measured, always-in-control tone. "Listen, this changes things. You have to be mindful of your image. The divorce alone was risky, but now we have to think about the company. The board won't be pleased if personal drama escalates. You need to contain the situation before it affects shareholder confidence." Daniel's frustration simmered. "It's more than a situation, Dad. These are my children we're talking about." His father's pause said enough. "Of course, family matters," he offered at last. "But if you lose your position, how will you provide for them? Don't forget who you're dealing with here. The press would love a scandal. Reevaluate your decisions before you do anything rash." He hung up with those words ringing in his head. An hour later, he found himself parking outside Sophie's parents' cozy suburban house. The sun had fully set, leaving a deep indigo sky above the quiet street lamps. Daniel surveyed the rows of neatly trimmed hedges, the porch light casting a warm glow on the front door. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, as if stepping back into a life he'd left behind. Sophie was already inside, greeting him with a polite nod. Neither spoke much beyond a stiff hello. Her parents were in the living room wearing worried expressions. Her mother fussed over them both while her father stood with arms folded over his chest. The tension felt thick enough to cut with a knife. They settled around the coffee table, cups of tea untouched. Sophie's father cleared his throat. "First off, we want what's best for Sophie, And for those babies, he began, casting a pointed look at Daniel. We've supported you as a couple, but we know you've hit rock bottom these last months. Now there are new responsibilities. Sophie's mother chimed in softly. We're concerned about whether Daniel can handle being a father while juggling this high-pressure career, and we worry about Sophie being left alone. Daniel bristled. I can handle responsibility, he replied, a defensive edge in his voice. Business troubles are part of life. It doesn't mean I'm incapable of taking care of my family. Sophie glanced at him sharply, her own frustrations flaring. But that's the problem, Daniel. You've prioritized your position over everything else. You've kept secrets about the company's finances. How can I trust you're going to show up for these babies when you didn't show up for our marriage? Her father pressed the advantage. We also heard rumors you might be on shaky ground at the company. Is that true? Or is it more corporate talk to control the narrative? Daniel felt cornered, heat rising in his face. Yes, my company is under pressure, but I'm working on solutions. This isn't about wanting to abandon anyone. I'm doing all this to secure our future. Sophie shook her head, emotion tightening her throat. Our future, or your reputation? The argument rose, voices overlapping. Her father tried to speak over Daniel. Her mother tried to calm Sophie. Accusations flew, about withheld information, about cutthroat investors, about ignoring emotional needs. The more they spoke, the more raw wounds tore open. Finally, Daniel had enough. He stood up so abruptly his teacup rattled on the table. Believe what you want, he spat, fists clenched at his sides. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to keep things afloat at a time when everything is crashing down on me. He shot Sophie a wounded look, then fixed her parents with a hard stare. I'm done being ganged up on tonight. He turned on his heel and headed for the door. Sophie rose to follow, but he pulled it open, letting the chilly night air rush in before she could reach him. She froze as he stepped out, the sound of his footsteps receding down the walkway. Her parents hovered behind, worried and apologetic. Sophie fought a wave of tears, struggling to maintain control. It felt like a fresh heartbreak every time she saw that pained, angry expression on Daniel's face. They were connected by more than paperwork now. They were connected by life growing inside her. Yet it seemed they were as far apart as ever. In the hush that followed, her mother placed a hand on Sophie's arm, while her father stared at the floor, regret clouding his features. Sophie didn't know whether to scream or sob. She knew one thing. The chasm between her and Daniel wasn't going to close itself. She moved to the front window, peering through the lace curtains. He was already gone, taillights disappearing down the street. Her heart pounded, each beat a reminder of how serious the stakes had become. Sophie stared at the door where Daniel stormed out, her heart pounding. We can't keep avoiding this. One way or another, we have to decide. Together. The loud hum of traffic outside Sophie's apartment punctuated the tail end of her restless afternoon. As she finished washing dishes from a lunch she'd barely touched, she glanced at her phone buzzing on the countertop. Daniel's name glowed on the screen, along with a short message asking if she would meet him for dinner, somewhere away from prying eyes and overbearing relatives. She read it twice, feeling a tug in her stomach that was part nerves, part hope. Despite her misgivings, she tapped out a brief reply. She would go. That evening, Sophie stood at the entrance of a small, upscale restaurant with softly lit windows. The place was discreet, almost tucked away, no glaring neon sign to attract attention. She brushed a stray hair from her face, steeling herself for whatever conversation lay ahead. The host, a middle-aged man with a courteous smile, led her to a secluded table near the back. The clink of silverware and gentle murmur of low conversation filled the space, creating a cocoon of privacy, perfect for two people who needed to sort through painful realities. Sophie settled into her seat, hands knotting anxiously in her lap. Daniel arrived moments later, suit jacket damp from the drizzle outside. He gave a short nod, his attempt at a polite greeting. She mirrored it. Neither of them seemed sure whether to hug, shake hands, or say anything beyond the stiff pleasantries of two people uncomfortably reunited. Once the host took their orders for drinks, water for her, whiskey on the rocks for him, they lapsed into silence. Daniel fiddled with his napkin, jaw clenched. Sophie smoothed the tablecloth, staring at the soft glow of a candle flickering between them. She could sense the intangible barrier that had grown over months of conflict, the same one she had tried so hard to breach. It felt odd to meet him like this, in a place designed for intimate evenings, when her heart still carried the ache of that night he'd walked out of her parents' home. He finally cleared his throat. "Thanks for coming," he said quietly, as if testing how loud he could speak without shattering whatever fragile peace they had. Sophie nodded. "I almost didn't." He managed a small, apologetic shrug. "But you did. That means something." A server swept by, setting down a basket of bread and 2 small plates, then slipped away, leaving them alone once more. Sophie watched the candlelight reflecting in Daniel's eyes as he stared at her. She felt the words forming, weighed by weeks of anger, sadness, and unanswered questions. But she let him speak first. "I wanted to see you without everyone else breathing down our necks," he said. "We need to talk about the twins, about everything, but not with your parents or my parents or the entire board hovering." His gaze flickered, showing weariness behind the controlled exterior. Sophie leaned forward slightly, wanting him to know she wasn't just there to accuse him again. "I'm listening," she said. He sighed, running a hand over his hair. "It's hard to even know where to start. It's like everything's come undone at the same time. My company's under strain, the divorce, you telling me you're pregnant. I'm struggling to keep any sense of balance." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. "I get that. But it hasn't exactly been easy for me either." She paused, remembering the sick feeling in her stomach the day she'd learned it was twins. "I'm carrying 2 babies, and I still don't know whether I'm about to raise them on my own." "I don't want you to do this alone," he answered, almost too quickly. "I never intended for our life to go this way." She thought back to their last months together, how the once passionate partnership had devolved into standoffish glances, then vicious arguments fueled by finances and the weight of people's opinions. She pressed her fingers against her temple. "It felt like you were always choosing the boardroom over me," she said softly. "Late nights, secret calls. I started to think you barely saw me as your wife anymore." His eyes flicked downward. "I know. I thought I could juggle it all. I've been chasing this huge contract that might save the company from a major blow. But the pressure got to me, and I took it out on you. I let it sabotage us. I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice carried a thread of regret that made her chest tighten. She whispered, "I'm sorry too. For the fights, the way I shut you out when I felt betrayed." They glanced up at the same time, each gauging whether it was safe to show vulnerability. Tentatively, Sophie reached out and brushed her fingers against the back of his hand. The contact was delicate, almost fleeting, but enough to spark a ghost of what they used to have. She recalled a sweeter memory, the first year of marriage, dancing barefoot in the living room. How sure they'd been that nothing could tear them apart. Before finances, before arguments over in-laws, before everything. Their dinners arrived, a simple pasta dish for Sophie, grilled fish for Daniel, but neither was truly focused on the meal. They picked at their food, letting scattered small talk fill the gaps. Sophie told him how she'd been feeling physically, exhausted, occasionally dizzy from the stress and her changing body. He offered quiet nods of empathy, apologizing again for not being there to help. The conversation took on a warmth that felt alien after all those months of tension. A sudden vibration on the table made them both jump. Daniel's phone screen lit up with a name Sophie recognized from the few times she'd visited him at work, an important investor. He gave a tight shrug, stood up, and stepped away from the table to take the call. Sophie forced herself to breathe evenly, trying not to eavesdrop as his voice lowered. Still, fragments reached her. "No, I can't sign that yet. Yes, I understand the board's concerns. Let me see if there's another approach." The measured tone left her uneasy. He returned after a few minutes, face drawn, shoulders tense. She offered a shaky smile as if bracing for bad news. "Everything okay?" He took his seat, glancing at the untouched fish on his plate. "We might be losing an investor if I don't lock down certain terms soon. They heard rumors about the divorce and are worried about the stability of my leadership. If I can't reassure them—" He trailed off, biting his lip. "I don't want to fail the company. Not now." Sophie set down her fork, recalling the old arguments that had led to their separation. "This is the part that always scared me," she murmured, "that no matter how much you care about the family we're starting, the company's demands will always overshadow us. I don't want to be left alone again." He dropped his gaze. "I'm trying to fix things, but I can't snap my fingers and fix them overnight." Quiet tension settled between them like a weight neither of them knew how to lift. She wasn't sure if a baby or two should be the reason to salvage a broken marriage, but some part of her still wanted to believe in the love they once shared. Maybe it could be enough if they worked at it. Maybe. They forced themselves to finish small portions of dinner. The hum of hushed conversation around them continued while the restaurant staff floated by, politely refilling water glasses. When the check arrived, Daniel handled it with a swiftness that suggested he wanted the night to end before more pressing calls came in. Sophie offered a tight smile of thanks, but a lingering ache of uncertainty stayed lodged in her chest. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the pavement gleaming under the muted glow of streetlights. A cool breeze swept by, carrying the scent of wet asphalt. They paused on the sidewalk, unsure of whether to part ways or continue the conversation. "I meant what I said," Daniel murmured, shifting from foot to foot. "I don't want to give up on us or on these babies." She studied him, searching for signs of genuine conviction. "I just hope your idea of not giving up involves something more than an apology," she said, voice subdued. "We can't keep stumbling between crisis calls and half-finished confessions. If we really want to fix this, it has to be a real effort." He opened his mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he reached out and gave her hand a brief squeeze, leaving a trace of warmth on her skin before letting go. Then he stepped toward his car, posture heavy with worry. Sophie stood for a moment longer, inhaling the damp night air. She wished she could find some reassuring certainty in the shadows, but all she found was the echo of his footsteps fading against the quiet city block. With a resigned sigh, she walked across the dark parking lot, rummaging in her purse for her keys. A swirl of emotions clouded her mind. A faint flicker of hope, overshadowed by the looming threat of Daniel's corporate troubles and the possibility that his promises would crumble under real-world pressure. Just as she unlocked her car, her phone buzzed again. She flipped it open to see a message from Daniel. The text felt like the hollow echo of what he couldn't say in person, yet it stirred something inside her nonetheless. Standing beside her car in the parking lot, Sophie checks her phone. A text from Daniel. "We need more time to figure this out. Please don't sign anything yet." Sophie woke to the soft hum of her phone vibrating on the bedside table. She squinted at the display, her mother's number. It was early, barely past 7, and she could already sense this wouldn't be an ordinary call. Stifling a groan, she answered in a hushed tone. "Sophie, darling," her mother began, sounding breathless and urgent. "I know this is last minute, but I really think we should have everyone over for dinner tonight. Your father agrees." Immediately on guard, Sophie sank deeper into her pillows. "Mom, I'm not sure that's a good idea," she murmured. "Daniel and I have enough to sort out without the added stress, and we both know how well our last get-together went." Her mother's breath crackled through the speaker. "Your father and I are worried. You're pregnant, twice over, and we can't pretend everything is fine. I know you two have tried to talk on your own, but this family needs to get on the same page. Sophie chewed her lip, picturing the tension that would fill the house if both sets of parents gathered under one roof. She thought back to the uneasy dinner Daniel had arranged days earlier, the flickering candlelight, the half-hopeful conversation. Then she remembered the swirl of corporate pressure always looming over him, over them, as if it might explode at any second. A headache brewed behind her eyes. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "I'll call you back." Ending the call, she sat up. Outside, sunlight bathed the quiet street through a thin lace curtain. Despite the warm glow, Sophie's mind roiled with uncertainty. The last time they'd attempted a family meeting, it had ended in raised voices and Daniel storming out. They'd agreed to keep some distance from parental meddling. Yet her mother's anxious tone made her want to bridge the gap, if only to regain some semblance of peace. She sent Daniel a quick message, asking if he'd heard anything from his parents. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with his reply. "They told me about dinner. Said it's important we show unity, but we need to be careful. My dad might push too far." Sophie blew out a slow breath, heart sinking. She knew Daniel's father well enough to understand his obsession with preserving the family's spotless image, especially in the eyes of the company's board members. She texted back a simple, "All right, see you tonight," then forced herself out of bed to start the day. As she dressed, a flutter in her stomach reminded her of the twins. The knowledge that 2 new lives rested on every decision she made weighed heavily, and she quietly vowed to protect them from a world of relentless scrutiny. The hours slipped by in a blur of small tasks. Around mid-afternoon, her mother called again, confirming that Daniel's parents would join them for dinner. Sophie tried to keep her voice measured, even as tension prickled at her. She spent the rest of the afternoon tidying her apartment and pacing the kitchen floor, fueled by a restless energy she couldn't quite shake. Eventually, it was time to drive over. She arrived at her parents' home close to sunset. The familiar driveway and well-tended yard with its blooming flower beds offered a fleeting sense of childhood comfort. Still, a subtle dread settled in her chest. She noticed Daniel's car was already parked by the curb, its sleek silhouette glinting under the orange sky. Inside, the smell of roast chicken and herbs filled the living room, warm, inviting, but overshadowed by the hushed tension that rose like steam from a pot left too long on the stove. Her mother bustled about, lighting a few candles on the mantel. Her father stood by the sofa, arms folded, greeting Sophie with a concerned nod. She tried to muster a smile, but it barely reached her eyes. Daniel was in the corner, talking in a low voice to his father. He paused when Sophie entered, meeting her gaze with a careful look. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hi," she replied, equally subdued. She glanced at his father, tall, suited, wearing that familiar stern expression. Daniel's mother hovered close by, her carefully styled hair and pastel blouse a clear effort to look presentable for an important evening, as she called it. They exchanged polite greetings, every syllable loaded with the knowledge of the fragile situation binding them together. Dinner itself started with forced small talk. Sophie's mother asked if Daniel had found a new investor. Daniel's father inquired about Sophie's health. The smell of home-cooked food drifted around them, but nobody seemed to have much appetite. Sophie's father eventually cleared his throat and asked everyone to sit. With some shuffling, they settled around the large wooden table. Dishes were passed in stiff silence, utensils clinking awkwardly against plates. Sophie's mother tried her best to fill the hush, sharing anecdotes about a neighbor's new dog, but even she couldn't keep the tension at bay. Eventually, Daniel set down his fork and clasped his hands together. "Look," he said, voice straining for calm. "I appreciate the concern, but we need to focus on the real issues. Sophie and I are stuck in limbo. The divorce is on hold, we're expecting twins, and the company is under scrutiny. I can't pretend all of this is easy to handle." His father nodded, exchanging a glance with Daniel's mother. "We've told you before, Daniel, your personal matters affect your professional standing. If the board senses too much instability in your life, they could force you out. We all have to be mindful of that. What if the press gets wind of a chaotic marriage? Heat flared in Sophie's chest. She set her spoon down more forcefully than she intended. With all due respect, I'm tired of hearing how my pregnancy affects a corporate image. These are children, not chess pieces. She felt her mother's hand on her arm, a gentle warning to stay calm, but Sophie couldn't hold back. I won't stand by and watch people talk about my babies like they're some publicity crisis. Daniel's father's brow furrowed. No one is trivializing the children, Sophie. We only want what's best for them. If your relationship with Daniel becomes a spectacle, or if it ruins his career, where does that leave you financially? Where does it leave the twins? A flush of frustration reddened Sophie's cheeks. She sensed her father stiffening on her other side, ready to jump to her defense. She drew a sharp breath, trying to keep her tone measured. I understand finances matter, but my biggest concern is bringing two babies into an environment where their father is constantly under pressure and their mother feels alone. A stable bank account means nothing if the family's broken. At that, Daniel spoke up. I'm willing to make changes, he said, addressing the table at large. Sophie's right. This can't just be about good optics or money. But the board isn't giving me much leeway. I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't. Everything's closing in. Sophie's father drummed his fingers on the table. Daniel, you want to keep the company afloat and remain CEO. We understand that. But can you honestly say you'll give Sophie and those babies the time and emotional support they deserve? The question hovered like a challenge. Daniel's shoulders sank. I'm trying, he murmured. I want to be there for them. He looked across the table at Sophie, who held his gaze with weary skepticism. In that moment, her heart twisted with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she could sense his genuine desire to fix things, but on the other, she remembered all the broken promises, the nights he'd left her waiting. Daniel's mother cleared her throat, trying to sound reassuring. We can support you both, she offered, though her eyes glinted with the same corporate practicality her husband displayed. But that means thinking about the bigger picture. Public relations, managing rumors. That's enough, Sophie's mother interrupted, voice gentle but firm. No one wants to see these babies become pawns in a marketing plan. She cast a meaningful look at her son-in-law. If you truly care about them, you'll find a way to stand up for them, even if it risks your position. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the tension at the table exploded first. His father bristled at the implication that Daniel might sacrifice his job. Sophie's father jumped in, forcefully telling him that family came before corporate demands. Voices rose, overlapping in confusion. Sophie felt her headache intensify, and she rubbed her temples, wishing for a moment of quiet. In the midst of the shouting, Daniel suddenly pushed back his chair. The sound screeched through the air, silencing everyone. He stood, eyes flashing with frustration and hurt. I can't keep having the same arguments, he said, voice trembling with pent-up tension. Yes, I made mistakes, but I won't let you all talk as though I care more about some boardroom than I do about my wife and kids. Sophie's heart lurched at the slip. Wife. But before she could speak, he turned and strode toward the front door. His father called after him, but Daniel didn't stop. The door slammed, and the entire house rattled with the force of his exit. Silence descended in his wake. Sophie's father slumped in his seat, running a hand over his face. His mother stared blankly at the half-finished plates. Daniel's parents exchanged glances of discomfort and disapproval. Sophie could barely breathe, her pulse hammering in her ears. She pushed back from the table, ignoring the worried glances directed at her. The storm had started outside now, a sudden downpour drenching the night sky. It felt fitting. Unable to stay still, Sophie rose and walked to the door, still ajar from Daniel's hasty exit. A swirl of cool, damp air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain. She stood there, leaning against the frame, mind racing with anger, hurt, and an odd flicker of resolve. It was one thing to fight with Daniel in private, but having their families weigh in, especially with the twins on the line, made her fiercely protective. She stared at the darkness beyond the porch, imagining Daniel's figure disappearing into the rain, tension knotted in his posture. How many times would they storm away from each other before the final breaking point? Or was this what it took to finally drive them to a real decision? As her parents and Daniels hovered in the background, exchanging hushed laments and uncertain apologies, Sophie felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't let her children's future be dictated by corporate whisperings or well-meaning but suffocating relatives. Leaning her forehead against the door, she muttered a promise, more to herself than anyone else. Sophie stares at the door where Daniel stormed out, her heart pounding. I won't let our babies become pawns in this twisted corporate game. The morning air felt unusually cold against Sophie's skin as she stepped onto her small balcony. She wrapped her sweater tighter around her body and stared out at the quiet street. Cars rolled by slowly, and neighbors walked their dogs or pushed strollers. It was all so deceptively normal, far from the turmoil swirling in her life. She pressed a hand to her stomach, reflecting on the night before when Daniel had stormed out of her parents' house. Even in the aftermath, she couldn't ignore how much she missed the version of him who used to hold her close and promise her the world. Returning inside, she poured herself some tea, thankful that the twins allowed a calmer stomach this morning. A few weeks ago, she might have written off her nausea as stress. Now everything was different. She had 2 lives inside her, 2 reasons to face her fears and figure out what went wrong with Daniel and his business. If he was hiding something, she needed to know. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Elena's name flashed on the screen. Sophie picked up, relieved to hear a friendly voice. "Hey," Elena said cheerfully. "How are you holding up? I know dinner with the families didn't exactly go smoothly." Sophie forced a small laugh. "That's putting it mildly." Daniel stormed out again. "I'm worried we're never going to patch things up at this rate." Elena's voice softened. "I'm sorry. I wish I could fix all this for you. But you're strong, Soph. We both know that." They chatted a bit more before Elena brought up a conversation from work, something about a big article referencing Daniel's company. Sophie felt her heart clench. She didn't follow the business pages religiously, but she'd noticed the swirl of rumors in recent months. Whispers of financial instability, deals on the verge of collapse, and hush-hush talks with new investors. She'd asked Daniel before, but he'd always brushed off her questions. Now, with twins on the way, she couldn't afford half-truths. "Elena," she said slowly, "I need your help. Could you look up anything you can find about Daniel's business situation? I mean, credible sources, documents, reports, anything. I can't keep guessing." Elena paused. "Are you sure you want to go down that rabbit hole?" Sophie closed her eyes, pressing the phone tighter to her ear. "I'm sure," she said quietly. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." They ended the call, and Sophie's stomach knotted with uneasy anticipation. By afternoon, Elena had emailed her links to several news articles, corporate filings, and a few public records. Sophie settled at the kitchen table with her laptop, scanning each piece of information carefully. Some were outdated, referencing Daniel's successful run as CEO in earlier years, praising his dynamic leadership. But the more recent articles hinted at a downturn, a big contract that fell through, rumored lawsuits from disgruntled partners. She found a segment about undisclosed debts, speculation that Daniel's company had taken large loans to prop up a struggling venture in another state. The details were vague, but the possibility alone was enough to make her heart pound. She remembered all the times he'd snapped at her questions, telling her not to worry because the situation is under control. Had it ever really been under control? Curiosity turned into a slow burn of anger. If he was in serious trouble, why not confide in her? Weren't they supposed to be a team, at least before everything unraveled? She pushed away from the table, trying to steady her breathing. Then, an idea took root. She might have saved bank statements, receipts, or other financial documents mixed in with old files from their shared home. After Daniel left for his condo, she'd thrown a bunch of stuff into storage boxes without sorting it all. Maybe she should look through it. Unearthing the boxes from her closet, Sophie sneezed as a puff of dust flew. She lugged them out, shoving aside out-of-season clothes. Each container was filled with a jumbled mix of items: photos, keepsakes, receipts, tax returns, even holiday decorations. She worked through them methodically, her frustration mounting. Time blurred while she sifted through the mess, scanning faded receipts and old statements. Just as she began to lose hope of finding anything relevant, her fingers grazed a plain manila folder buried under a pile of gift-wrap scraps. She opened the folder, breath catching at the sight of company letterheads, thick with official stamps and signatures. Some pages were standard financial logs, but others looked like memoranda referencing short-term loans Daniel's company had taken out months ago. Sophie read details of staggeringly high interest rates, looming deadlines, and frantic attempts to renegotiate terms. Page after page, it was clear the company had been in dire straits for a while, maybe even when she and Daniel were still together under the same roof. The realization churned in her gut. Daniel had chosen to shoulder this burden alone, or at least keep it hidden, maybe to protect his image or spare her from worry. But all it had done was drive a wedge between them. Her hands trembled, eyes burning at the betrayal. If he'd come to her, they might have faced it together. Instead, he'd given her half-answers and built walls of secrecy. No wonder their relationship had spiraled into so many arguments about money. Her phone's chime tore her from her thoughts. She saw Daniel's name again, this time calling. Sophie pressed the phone to her ear, voice tight. "Hey, Sophie," he said, sounding cautious. "We need to talk. I keep getting wind of rumors about the company, and you haven't returned my messages all day." She swallowed, her throat painfully dry. "I've been busy," she said, hugging the folder against her chest. "And I know about the rumors, Daniel. Actually, I've spent the last couple hours learning everything I can." His pause was palpable. "What do you mean?" She ignored the heartbreak drumming in her chest. "I found documents, loan agreements, some stuff about partners threatening lawsuits. I had no idea it was this severe. Why did you keep it from me?" The faint background noise on his end stopped, as if he'd stepped into a quieter space. "Sophie, it's not that simple. The last thing I wanted was to add more stress to our lives. I was protecting us, protecting you. I planned to fix it before it spiraled." Hot tears pooled in her eyes. She clutched the phone, stifling the urge to yell. "Don't you think lies and secrecy create more stress? We're married, Daniel. At least we were supposed to be partners. I could have helped, or at least not felt blindsided." His breathing shifted, betraying his frustration. "I couldn't risk the truth getting out. The board, the investors, they're relentless. If word leaked that I was struggling financially, they'd yank funding in a heartbeat. I was trying to hold everything together." She let out a bitter laugh, though it came out broken. "Well, congratulations. You managed to hold it together long enough to watch our marriage fall apart. And now our babies are coming into a situation I barely understand because you shut me out." Silence stretched between them, thick and painful. Finally, he sighed. "Look, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix things, but I don't know what else to say right now." Sophie wiped a tear from her cheek, heartbreak colliding with anger in her chest. She studied the scattered papers at her feet, each one a tangible symbol of how deep this betrayal ran. Part of her wanted to crumple them into a ball and hurl them across the room, as if that could erase the damage. But another part of her recognized that behind the secrets, Daniel might have been terrified, convinced he was doing the right thing. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "We can't go on like this, hiding, lying, protecting illusions. It has to stop." He inhaled sharply as though bracing for a blow. "I know. Look, let's talk in person soon. Maybe tomorrow?" She closed her eyes, exhaustion draining the fight out of her. "We'll see," she said, then ended the call before she could get tangled in his apologies again. Setting the phone on the table, she sank to the floor, leaning against the couch for support. Papers and receipts lay scattered, each one condemning Daniel's actions. The real wound was how he'd felt compelled to hide it, as though trusting her wasn't an option. Was their bond really that fragile, or had it been fear driving him? She touched her abdomen, thinking of the twins. They deserved a solid foundation, parents who wouldn't spin web after web of half-truths. But was it too late to salvage anything? Her mind churned with questions about their future, about whether Daniel could change, whether she could forgive him. She swallowed back a fresh wave of tears, reaching out to gather the documents into a single damning pile. They felt heavy, not just physically, but with the weight of disappointment and betrayal. Sophie holds the stack of damning financial records in trembling hands, murmuring, "If he couldn't trust me with this, how can I trust him now?" Sophie stood in front of the bathroom mirror, pressing a hand to her chest as she tried to slow her frantic breathing. Her face looked pale, and her eyes were ringed with tired shadows. Another wave of nausea churned in her stomach, reminding her of just how unstable she felt these days, not only emotionally but physically too. The twins were growing, and she could sense their increasing demands on her body. But it wasn't just the pregnancy weighing her down, it was everything else piled on top. She ran cold water, splashing some onto her cheeks. The apartment was quiet, yet her thoughts echoed like an unending clamor. Only last night, she'd pored over those incriminating financial documents that revealed the depth of Daniel's business troubles. They had barely spoken since, trading tense calls that ended in more confusion than resolution. The question was always the same. Could they salvage their relationship and still manage this looming crisis? Or was it too late? A buzz from the living room made her jump. Her phone vibrated on the table and the screen lit up with Daniel's name. Sophie eyed it warily before answering. "Hey," she said, voice thick with fatigue. He sounded rushed, as though he were walking quickly. In the background, she could hear muffled traffic and distant voices. "We need to talk about the next court date," he said, breath uneven. "The board's pushing me to settle things quickly. They can't handle any more uncertainty about my personal life." Sophie's hand tightened on the phone. "So you're calling to say we should finalize the divorce?" Her voice was taut with simmering anger and an ache she couldn't ignore. He paused. "No, I'm not saying that. But the board is giving me an ultimatum. Either I tie up the loose ends or they'll question my leadership altogether. For them, that means divorcing you and moving on, or reconciling in a way that stops all the rumors. He trailed off, as if gathering his thoughts. "I don't know what to do." She took a shaky breath, her free hand pressing instinctively against her abdomen. "What about me? I'm the one actually carrying twins. Where do I fit into your equation aside from being labeled a loose end?" "That's not how I see you," he snapped, sounding pained. "But the board, they're ruthless, Sophie. They think every personal decision of mine reflects on the company. I'm caught between wanting to protect you and the babies and needing to keep the business afloat so I can actually provide for you all." A spike of anger flared. "Protect me? Daniel, you lied to me for months about the company's debt. You still keep secrets. Do you really want me in your life? Or is this about not wanting the scandal to cost you your position?" He sighed, the sound crackling over the line. "Stop assuming the worst of me. I do want you. I do want our children. But I can't just ignore the board. They hold the fate of my company in their hands." "That company is more important to you than anything," she replied bitterly. "You know what? I have to go. I have a meeting with my doctor. I'm not feeling too great." She ended the call abruptly, not waiting for a response. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she forced herself to breathe deeply. Maybe it was partially her hormones, but the stress felt suffocating. As if on cue, a wave of dizziness hit her, forcing her to sit on the couch. She closed her eyes, willing the faintness to subside. Eventually, she rose and decided it was best to keep busy. Her plan was to stop by her workplace briefly. She'd taken a leave of absence. but there were still a few personal items she needed to pick up. Then she had a quick doctor's appointment. Grabbing her keys and purse, she left the apartment, stepping into a cool mid-morning light. The drive to her office building was riddled with stop-and-go traffic, and every honk of a horn made her already frazzled nerves jangle. She parked and headed inside, determined to slip in unnoticed. But as she reached her old apartment, a few co-workers who were in the middle of a hallway chat spotted her. Their concerned faces immediately swarmed around her. "Sophie, are you all right?" one asked, eyes flicking to her midsection. She offered a strained smile, trying to be polite. Another colleague gently squeezed her hand, as if no words were needed to convey sympathy. Rumors about her pregnancy and impending divorce had clearly made the rounds. Feeling cornered by their well-meaning concern, she grabbed her box of personal items from her old desk and rushed out, promising to catch up another time. Back in the parking lot, she felt wobbly on her feet. The close call of fainting earlier still hovered on her mind, and she realized she hadn't eaten anything that morning. Nerves had stolen her appetite again, but her stomach had started growling, and she knew ignoring it was a bad idea. She decided to grab a quick sandwich before the doctor's appointment. After picking up something small at a cafe drive-thru, she arrived at the doctor's office feeling a little steadier. The waiting room was brightly lit, a few expectant mothers flipping through magazines or checking phones. Sophie sank into a chair, exhaling slowly. Her name was called soon enough, and she followed the nurse to a small exam room. The nurse took her vitals, frowning slightly at Sophie's elevated pulse. After some questions about her stress levels, she stepped out so the doctor could come in. Sophie waited, alone with her thoughts. The tension in her chest persisted, each breath tightening at the memory of Daniel's frantic calls and the board's demands. She caught herself wondering if the constant pressure might actually harm the babies. When the doctor entered, her demeanor was calm but firm. Sophie found herself explaining the migraines, the dizziness, how her emotions swung wildly. The doctor listened carefully, then spoke in a gentle, measured tone. "You need to reduce your stress, Sophie. Pregnancy with twins can be more challenging. Your blood pressure is a bit elevated. I'd like to keep an eye on it." Sophie forced a small nod. "I'm trying," she said, her voice catching. "It's just, everything is happening at once." "Lean on those you trust," the doctor advised, scribbling some notes. "And please, if you feel faint again, come in immediately. The next few weeks are crucial." Leaving the office, Sophie found herself blinking back tears. If only it were that simple to reduce stress. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a board member's name, a person she vaguely recognized from Daniel's corporate events. The last thing she wanted was to be roped into a conversation about the company's demands. She started driving home, but halfway there, her head pounded with a sudden intensity. She pulled into a small shopping center parking lot to catch her breath. Her vision blurred, the lines of the world swaying. Panic surged. She realized that if she pushed herself any further without rest, she could truly harm herself or the twins. Fumbling, she opened her phone and dialed Daniel's number. He picked up, voice tense. "I'm in a meeting," he said tersely. The world seemed to spin around her. "Daniel, I'm not feeling well. I'm dizzy, I can't—" Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and spots of dark edged her vision. She heard him swear on the other end. Then his voice came through more clearly. "Sophie, where are you? Hang on, I'll come get you." She tried to tell him her location, but everything became fuzzy. Darkness crept in. The phone slipped from her hand as she lost consciousness. When Sophie came to, she found herself lying on a hospital bed, the smell of disinfectant strong in her nose. Daniel was right beside her, gripping her hand, face etched with worry. Monitors beeped softly and a nurse adjusted an IV in her arm. "What happened?" Sophie asked, voice weak. Daniel's relief was palpable. "You fainted in a parking lot. Someone called an ambulance. I got there as fast as I could." She blinked, recalling only fragments of the moment when she'd pulled over, then the onrush of dizziness. "The twins," she murmured, fear gripping her. "The doctor checked," Daniel answered quickly. "They're all right, but you need rest. No more pushing yourself. It was the stress, and maybe low blood sugar too." Her eyes welled with tears, and she inhaled shakily. "Every time I think we're hitting rock bottom, it gets worse," she whispered, voice trembling. "I can't do this alone, Daniel." He squeezed her hand gently. "You're not alone. I promise." And for once, there was no note of frantic distraction in his voice, just genuine worry. A doctor entered, gave Sophie instructions to stay overnight for observation, then left them in the quiet hush of the room. She could feel Daniel's gaze, filled with remorse, perhaps fear at how close she'd come to a more serious situation. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, his phone buzzed on the bedside table. He shot it a glance. "It's the board," he muttered, eyes darkening with tension. Sophie saw him slip out into the hallway, presumably to answer the call. When the door drifted shut behind him, she settled back against the pillows, her body still shaky. Whatever decision Daniel made, it would define not just his career but the shape of their family. Her gaze flicked to the door, imagining the push and pull raging on the other side. Daniel steps outside the hospital room, faced with a decisive phone call from his board. "What do you choose, your CEO seat or the life you've built?" an impatient voice demands. Sophie woke in the hospital room to a dull ache in her temples and a gnawing hollowness in her chest. The thin gray light of morning filtered through the blinds, illuminating the white sheets pulled tight over her legs. She blinked slowly, the events of the previous day surfacing in her mind like jagged rocks. She had fainted in a parking lot, overwhelmed by worry and exhaustion. Daniel had found her and rushed her here. The board had called him yet again, demanding he fix his personal drama or risk losing his CEO seat. The door opened, and a kind-faced nurse stepped in. After checking Sophie's blood pressure and temperature, the nurse informed her that if her vitals remained stable, she would likely be discharged by late afternoon. Sophie thanked her, relieved but still drained. Left alone once more, Sophie stared at her phone lying on the bedside table. It hadn't buzzed in a while, a welcome break from the relentless flood of calls and texts. She lifted it and saw only one unread message from her mother, urging her to rest and to trust that everything would work out. Sophie sighed. Trust felt like a fragile concept these days. A light knock on the doorframe made her glance up. Daniel appeared, still wearing yesterday's clothes, hair rumpled, dark circles smudged beneath his eyes. He carried a steaming paper cup of coffee and a small pastry bag. "You're awake," he said softly, offering a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I brought you something, in case the hospital breakfast wasn't enough." Sophie nodded a quiet thanks. It had been days, no, weeks, since she'd seen that flicker of genuine concern in him without the usual tension overshadowing everything else. She gestured for him to come closer, and he dragged a chair to her bedside, hesitating before settling down. "You look tired," she murmured. He shrugged. "Didn't sleep much. Couldn't stop thinking about, well, everything." They let the silence stretch between them. Outside, a cart rattled down the hallway, and the smell of disinfectant clung to the air. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "How are you feeling? The doctor said you'd be all right, but that your blood pressure was high." "I'm better," she said, pressing her hand against her abdomen. "The twins are fine, thank God, but I need to reduce stress, which seems impossible right now." He rubbed the back of his neck, gaze flicking downward. "I'm sorry," he said. "I hate that I keep adding pressure to your life. I want to protect you from all this, but the board and the investors won't relent," she finished. "And you still need to decide which sacrifices you're willing to make." She expected him to argue, but he just inhaled shakily. "There's a new merger proposal on the table. The biggest investor in the deal is worried about stability. They think the ongoing rumors about my personal life could jeopardize the entire negotiation. My father called last night after I left you here to rest, telling me how crucial it is to present a clean slate. His voice came out ragged. They basically want me to finalize the divorce or at least make a clear-cut decision. They don't want a hint of scandal. Sophie gripped the sheets, anger stirring. So that's it? They're dictating whether we stay married? Seems that way. He sighed in frustration. And to be honest, Sophie, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I don't comply, I'll lose everything. The chance to keep the company running, the chance to provide for you and the babies. She felt her heart clench. We're not just babies, Daniel, and I'm not some line item on your balance sheet. I can't be forced into or out of a marriage because of a board's demands. Her voice cracked on the last words, revealing the desperation she tried so hard to mask. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away reflexively, uncertain whether she needed comfort or a way to shield herself from more pain. Sophie, listen, he said quietly. There's no easy answer. If I step down, the company might collapse under the current debt. That leaves our children without stable support. But if I stay at the cost of divorcing you, his voice faltered. I'm not trying to make you feel used. She shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. You keep saying you're protecting me, but it feels like you're only protecting your job. And you've lied to me, kept secrets. How can I be sure that this time is any different? He stood suddenly, running a hand through his hair. The coffee he'd brought sat untouched on the tray, growing cold. I wish I could rewind everything, tell you the truth from the start, never let it come to this, but that's not how life works. Silence wrapped around them again. Sophie stared at her reflection in the window, noticing how wan and drawn she looked, reminiscent of someone facing the aftermath of a battle she never expected to fight. Daniel fumbled for words. Maybe the divorce would protect you from the fallout, he said, voice hollow. If we finalize it, the press might move on. You'd get financial support no matter what. You'd live without the board's scrutiny breathing down your neck. Her jaw tightened. So that's your solution? Push me away so I'm not a liability? Do you even want to fix this? He looked pained. Of course I do, but I'm backed into a corner. The merger is the only thing that can keep the company afloat. If I refuse, the board will cut ties and we lose everything. If we finalize the divorce, at least you and the babies won't be dragged through endless headlines. Sophie bit down on her lip, tasting the bitterness of the words she wanted to say. I can't believe we've come to this. We used to talk about building a future, kids, a home, growing old together. Now we're talking about divorcing so a handful of investors feel safe about their returns. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it all. She settled on letting out a choked breath, tears threatening to spill. Daniel, looking desperate, tried to approach her again. Please understand, I'm not choosing the board over you. I'm choosing the lesser evil. She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach. It doesn't feel that way. Before he could reply, the door opened with a gentle tap. A doctor entered, greeting them with a nod. She checked Sophie's blood pressure, temperature, and read through a chart with a practiced efficiency. Everything seems stable, the doctor said kindly. Let's just finalize a few more details, and you can be discharged. But do remember, you need low stress, healthy meals, and consistent rest. That's non-negotiable with twins. Sophie managed a tired smile. Thank you, doctor. Once the doctor left, Daniel gathered his courage to speak again, but Sophie held up a hand, stopping him. Her exhaustion ran deeper than physical fatigue. It was a weariness of spirit, of constant fighting and the feeling that every path led to heartache. Enough for now, she whispered. I want to go home, rest, and think clearly. Alone. He reluctantly nodded. I'll arrange a ride for you. Or do you want me to drive you? I'll call a friend, she replied, voice steeled with quiet resolve. I can't bear any more arguments today. She turned her face away, blinking back tears. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. A reminder that this was still a hospital, a place of healing where she'd found none yet, save for the fleeting knowledge that her babies were healthy. True to her word, when it came time to leave, she contacted Elena, who arrived with a sympathetic smile and gentle hug. They exchanged a few murmured words while Daniel stood aside, not daring to intrude. Sophie noticed how his eyes flickered with regret, but she felt too drained to offer any consolation. In the car, Elena asked questions, her tone laced with concern. Sophie filled her friend in on the gist, how the merger hinged on Daniel looking stable and how that might mean divorcing. Elena's face turned grim. "That's insane," she muttered, hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this." Back at her apartment, Sophie thanked Elena for the ride. Once inside, she sank onto the couch, hugging a cushion against her chest. Her eyes roamed across the tidy living room, focusing on the divorce papers still tucked in an envelope on the coffee table. She couldn't help but imagine how close they were to becoming real, binding, and final. She reached for the envelope, feeling its weight in her hand. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe this was best for the twins, so they could avoid the frenzy of his corporate meltdown. But the thought of signing it made her stomach twist. Was it truly the lesser evil, or just the easiest way to avoid a fight he feared losing? Her phone chimed, and a message from Daniel appeared. "Let me know if you need anything." She set the phone aside, unwilling to reply. She simply stared at the divorce papers with a hollow gaze, every ounce of her energy gone. Eventually she stood and moved to the window, the late afternoon sun casting a golden hue across the nearby buildings. Normally she found comfort in such views, but now all she felt was a suffocating sense of loss. She rested a hand on her belly, tears slipping freely down her cheeks. Sophie closed her eyes, whispering into the silence of her empty apartment. With each passing moment, her resolve to fight for her marriage ebbed. If Daniel was prepared to sacrifice their relationship to appease the board, maybe she should stop hoping he would choose differently. In that moment, she truly felt alone. Then, with trembling fingers, she picked up the pen that lay beside the envelope. She stared at it, imagining a future where she was no longer Daniel's wife, just the mother of his children, navigating life without him. A dull ache spread through her chest at the thought, and still, she couldn't see any alternative. Sophie feels abandoned and is ready to sign the final separation, believing that Daniel will not fight for her and the babies. Sophie stood by her window, the early morning sky still tinted a pale blue, streaked with soft pinks where the sun began to rise. She hadn't slept more than a couple of hours, and her eyes felt gritty. Across the room sat the envelope containing the divorce papers, next to a sleek black pen that glinted ominously in the dim light. The final court date had arrived. She'd gone back and forth the night before, so many times she'd lost count, but every path seemed to end in the same place, letting go. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, trying to steady the swirl of dread and sadness roiling inside. Part of her wanted to tear the papers to shreds, ignoring the demands from Daniel's board and the pressure from both families. Another part whispered that everything was too broken to salvage, that it was pointless to keep clinging to the hope Daniel might choose her and the twins over his corporate obligations. Her phone buzzed on the table. She checked the screen. It was just another well-meaning message from her best friend Elena, urging her to breathe and think carefully before doing anything irreversible. Sophie typed a quick reply, something vague and apologetic, then tossed the phone aside. Outside, the day brightened by degrees. The weight of the upcoming court hearing pressed on her like a tangible force. In just a few hours, she would stand in front of a judge, pen poised above the signature line that would end her marriage, legally and permanently. She pulled on a simple black dress that no longer fit quite as loosely around her waist. The twins were growing every day, a silent reminder that this wasn't just about her anymore. Even so, as she slipped on her shoes, she tried to shake the nagging fear that she was walking into her final heartbreak. When she arrived at the courthouse, she found the corridors buzzing with people, lawyers juggling thick files, couples with guarded expressions. The air smelled faintly of old varnish and stale coffee. Sophie caught her reflection in a glass-paneled door. She looked small and pale, overshadowed by tension. A wave of nausea hit her, but she swallowed it down, squared her shoulders, and made her way down the hall toward the assigned courtroom. Her attorney, a somber-faced woman with neatly braided hair, stood waiting just outside. She offered a polite smile that didn't quite disguise her concern. "Morning, Sophie," she said softly. "Are you all right? You look worn out." Sophie managed a tight nod. "Just want to get this over with." The attorney's gaze flickered. She motioned toward the polished wooden doors. "We'll be called in soon. Is Daniel coming?" Sophie lifted a shoulder in a stiff shrug. "He said he would be, but I haven't heard from him all morning." She tried not to let the sting show in her voice. So typical, she thought. His unpredictability had defined their final weeks. Half-hearted apologies followed by urgent phone calls he had to take for just a minute, running out the door to put out fires at work. She clutched her purse, determined to remain composed even if he never showed up. A clerk in a crisp white shirt leaned out of the courtroom, scanning the hallway. "We're ready for you," he announced. Sophie took a shaky breath and walked inside, her attorney close behind. Rows of benches faced the raised platform where the judge sat. The old wooden pews creaked under the weight of anxious parties waiting for their turn. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, and she forced her chin up. It was time. She slid onto a bench near the front, noticing the empty spot where Daniel should have been. Her attorney tried to catch her eye, but Sophie focused on the seat beside her, unoccupied and glaringly vacant. She gripped the edge of the bench, feeling ice spread through her veins. After a short wait, the judge, an older woman with wire-rimmed glasses, called Sophie's case. Sophie's name echoed in the hush of the courtroom. Swallowing hard, she rose, stepping forward. The judge's gaze traveled from Sophie's pale face to the empty space at the defense table. "Where is your husband, Mrs. Coleman?" the judge asked, voice patient but firm. Sophie's attorney cleared her throat. "We believe he's on his way, Your Honor, but we haven't been able to confirm. My client is prepared to proceed today." The judge nodded slowly. "Very well." Sophie could sense the pitying stares behind her, the eyes that must think Daniel had abandoned her in the final hour. She tried not to tremble, but her fingers shook as she reached into her purse for the documents she'd come to dread. Her attorney passed them to the clerk, who carried them up to the judge's desk. "Mrs. Coleman," the judge said gently, "you understand that by signing these papers today, the marriage will be legally dissolved?" Sophie nodded, forcing her voice not to crack. "Yes, Your Honor." Silence wrapped around them. The judge frowned a bit, as though searching for a sign of doubt in Sophie's face. But time stretched on. Finally, the judge offered a small, resigned sigh. "All right, then." Leaning over, Sophie steadied her hand. The pen felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the full weight of her heartbreak. She inhaled sharply, reminding herself that Daniel had not shown up to stop her, that his promises had always rung hollow once the board intervened. She started lowering the pen toward the paper. Suddenly, the doors behind her burst open. A gasp rippled through the rows of onlookers. Sophie's heart lurched as she spun around to see Daniel charging forward, breathless, eyes wild. He looked as though he'd run all the way here, his tie askew, hair damp with sweat. "Wait!" he shouted, voice echoing in the stunned hush. Sophie's grip on the pen slackened. She felt a flurry of emotions, anger, relief, love, and a bone-deep fear that this was a last-ditch performance to save face. Daniel strode up to the table, ignoring the judge's reproachful glare for disrupting the proceedings. He planted himself beside Sophie, breathing hard. "Your Honor," he said, voice unsteady but determined, "please, don't finalize this. He turned to Sophie, eyes shining with a mix of desperation and resolve. "I'm sorry I'm late. Sorry for everything. I was on a call with the board. They threatened to remove me as CEO if I didn't finalize the divorce. But—" He stopped, swallowing against the lump in his throat. Sophie stared at him, heart hammering so loudly she was sure everyone could hear. "I told them I'm done letting them dictate my life," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I choose my family no matter what it costs. I choose you, Sophie, and I choose our children. Even if I lose the merger, even if I lose everything, I won't lose you." A stunned whisper spread through the small crowd. Sophie's attorney glanced between them, eyes wide. The judge raised a hand for silence, then peered at Daniel over the rim of her glasses. "You realize," the judge said, "that if your personal affairs disrupt your company, it could lead to financial consequences that affect both of you. You said you choose your family. That's commendable, but I need to know if this is genuine or a moment of theatrical display to stall the divorce." Daniel didn't hesitate. "It's real, Your Honor. I love my wife. I can't let her go. I'm sorry I nearly did." Tears burned at the corners of Sophie's eyes. She realized her hand still held the pen, but her heart no longer felt certain about signing. Fear warred with hope inside her, the memory of how many times they'd tried and failed clawing at her confidence. But in Daniel's face, she saw a man ready, truly ready, to put it all on the line. The judge tapped the papers with a pensive expression. "Given these circumstances, I'm inclined to take a recess and allow you both to speak privately. You'll return to confirm or withdraw the divorce petition. Understood?" Both nodded, hearts pounding. The judge gestured to a clerk, who escorted them into a side chamber lined with shelves of thick legal volumes. The door closed behind them, shutting out the buzzing gossip in the main courtroom. Daniel and Sophie stood in the quiet room, the tension nearly unbearable. He tentatively reached for her hand. This time she didn't pull away. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she couldn't tell if it was from relief or the wave of raw emotions coursing through her. He squeezed her fingers, eyes searching hers. "I'm here, Sophie. I'm sorry it took me so long to truly fight for us. I'm choosing you, no matter what." In the judge's private office, Sophie looks up at Daniel, her heart thudding. He whispers, "I'm choosing us, no matter what." They stood facing each other in the judge's cramped private office, shelves lined with old law books looming around them. The steady hum of conversations from the courtroom filtered faintly through the door. For a moment, neither Sophie nor Daniel spoke, as though each feared that the slightest wrong word might break the fragile closeness that had formed in the instant Daniel burst in to halt the divorce. Sophie drew in a shaky breath, her heart still galloping after what had happened in the main courtroom. She searched Daniel's face, needing to see the conviction behind his words. The tension in her shoulders eased only a fraction when she noticed that the determination in his eyes wasn't fading. She still felt the pen in her hand, the divorce papers lying on a side table, but the wave of despair that had washed over her earlier was lifting, replaced by a trembling glimmer of hope. Daniel reached out and rested one hand lightly on her arm, as if cautious not to scare her away. "I know I haven't earned your trust back yet," he whispered, "but I meant every word out there. It can't all be about the board or the shareholders. I won't lose you." She exhaled, fighting the urge to cry. "We've said so many things to each other these last months. We both know words alone aren't enough. What happens when your father or the investors corner you again?" His gaze flickered with self-reproach. "I'll tell them the truth. I'm not finalizing a divorce for the sake of optics. And if that means they replace me, then so be it. This is more important." Her heart wrenched at the sincerity in his voice. She never imagined the day would come when Daniel would so openly defy his board, his father, and everyone else who'd pressured him to stay in control. He slipped his hand down to hers, interlacing their fingers. "I'm sorry I almost let them destroy us," he said, voice cracking. "Please, believe me when I say I'm done letting them hold my life hostage." She found herself nodding, tears threatening to spill. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the entire ordeal, or maybe it was the love she still felt for him, but something inside her began to thaw. Slowly, carefully, Sophie squeezed his hand. "All right," she murmured, blinking away the haze in her vision. "All right, but let's figure out how to prove it, to each other and to everyone else." A sharp knock on the door made them both look up. The clerk peeked in, trying to keep his voice low. "The judge is giving you a few more minutes, but she'll need your final decision soon." Daniel cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, then turned back to Sophie. "Should we—" She looked at the abandoned divorce papers on the table. Her entire body tensed at the thought of signing them. Instead, she released a trembling breath and walked over to them. In one decisive motion, she closed the manila folder and set the pen down. "We'll tell her we don't want a divorce," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, relief softening the worry lines at his brow. "We can do this," he said, more to himself than to her. They followed the clerk out of the small room, every step echoing in Sophie's mind like a new beginning. The judge regarded them from her seat with a stern but not unkind expression. Sophie's attorney, standing off to one side, showed the faintest hint of a relieved smile. Daniel's side of the room was conspicuously empty. No father, no corporate lawyer, no anxious board member. This was just the two of them, facing the consequences of their own choices. Sophie swallowed hard. "Your Honor," she said, voice resonating through the hush, "I don't want to finalize this divorce." She turned to Daniel, finding the courage to say it out loud in front of everyone. "We're going to try again." The judge gazed at them over her glasses. "Are you absolutely sure?" she asked. "I don't enjoy seeing couples come back and forth with indecision. If you dismiss this petition now, you need to be prepared for the legal and emotional commitment that implies." Daniel stepped forward, jaw set. "I'm sure. We both are." A moment's silence, then the judge gave a curt nod. "Very well. The petition is dismissed. Please take it off the docket. I strongly suggest the two of you seek counseling or mediation to work through the issues that brought you here in the first place. I wish you both the best of luck." Sophie felt an immense rush of emotion, as though the tension that had built up since daybreak was finally draining away. Without a word, Daniel placed a hand at the small of her back and guided her out of the courtroom. People in the hallway openly stared at them, some curious, some indifferent, a few with half smiles. But Sophie hardly noticed. The magnitude of what they'd just done consumed her. The moment they stepped outside into the bustling midday light, the first person to greet them was Daniel's father, waiting at the top of the courthouse steps. Sophie's heart sank a little at his stern demeanor. "Did you sign?" he asked, voice clipped. Daniel's posture grew stiff. "No, we didn't." He glanced at Sophie, then faced his father with a firmness she hadn't often witnessed. "I'm not giving up my family to appease the board or protect my image." His father's face twisted into something that was half frustration, half alarm. "Daniel, you realize what you're risking?" "I do," Daniel interrupted quietly but resolutely, "and I'll handle the consequences." Sophie almost expected a barrage of arguments or guilt-laden pleas, but Daniel's father only stared at them, chest rising and falling with a silent storm of emotions. Finally, he pressed his lips into a thin line and turned away, pulling out his phone. Sophie guessed he'd be reporting the news to the board. Let him, she thought. This was their life. As if on cue, a few members of the press appeared on the sidewalk, snapping photos and calling out Daniel's name, aiming cameras at him and Sophie. She instinctively moved closer to him, feeling self-conscious. Daniel shielded her from the brunt of the shouting questions, something about sources inside the company and the state of the marriage. He lifted a hand, politely declining to comment, and ushered Sophie down the steps, where a black sedan waited. Inside the car, Sophie allowed herself to breathe. Daniel slipped into the seat beside her, looking just as shaken. The driver pulled away, leaving the courthouse and the press behind. For a few minutes, neither spoke. Then, Daniel reached across the seat, finding Sophie's hand and holding it tight. "Thank you," he said softly, "for giving me a chance to fix the mess I made." She squeezed his fingers. "It's going to take work," she whispered, half to him, half to herself. "I know," he replied, "but I'm ready." When they reached Sophie's apartment, he helped her inside, and she dropped her purse on the couch. The place smelled faintly of lavender air freshener, a comfort against the chaotic swirl of the morning. Daniel hesitated by the door, as if unsure whether she wanted him to stay. Sophie walked up to him, searching his eyes. "Don't go yet," she murmured. "We need to talk. About everything." He nodded, and they settled together on the couch. The intimacy felt both familiar and oddly new, like rediscovering the warmth of someone you'd once known well. Sophie folded her legs beneath her, turning to face him. "We've got finances to figure out. The board may cut you off. Are you ready for that?" Daniel blew out a breath. "They might. Then I'll find another way. Even if it means stepping down. My father will disapprove, but if we can find an investor or restructure the business, maybe there's hope. If not, I'll start over somewhere else. I'm tired of living in fear." She studied his features, each line of stress etched into his brow. What if it's not enough? A flicker of anxiety crossed his face. "Then we adapt. I can't promise we won't struggle, but at least we'll be honest about it. No more secrets." He reached out, gingerly placing a hand over her abdomen, where the twins had already begun to make their presence known. "I won't walk away from you or them." Her gaze softened, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Gently, he brushed it away with his thumb. She leaned into his touch, remembering the early days of their relationship, how tender he could be. Maybe that wasn't gone after all. In the days that followed, life was far from calm. Daniel faced multiple heated calls with board members, some of whom resigned in protest. His parents vacillated between alarm and grudging support, uncertain how to handle his new stance. Sophie's mother and father, though relieved the divorce was off the table, pestered her with questions about finances and child-rearing plans. Yet amid the storms, a quiet determination blossomed in Sophie's chest, fueled by Daniel's unwavering presence at her side. An unexpected sliver of hope emerged when one of Daniel's longtime associates agreed to invest in a partial restructuring, provided Daniel could prove his personal issues were no longer a ticking time bomb. Daniel tackled it with a transparency he'd never shown before, inviting Sophie into every meeting, copying her on every email that concerned their shared future. Though still exhausted and prone to dizzy spells, she felt recognized as a true partner for the first time. A few weeks later, in a softly lit ultrasound room, they finally got a fresh glimpse of the twins. The technician pressed the wand gently against Sophie's belly, revealing two distinct shapes on the screen. Rapid, fluttering heartbeats filled the space with a joyful rhythm. Daniel stood close, hand tightly clasping Sophie's, eyes shining with unmasked awe. The babies were healthy, growing as expected. There was even a playful moment where one twin seemed to nudge the other, prompting a round of laughter from the technician. Outside, in the corridor, Daniel couldn't stop smiling. "I never thought staring at grainy images on a monitor could make me feel this happy," he admitted, voice tinged with wonder. Sophie leaned against him, her own relief palpable. The last few weeks had tested them in more ways than she cared to count, but in that moment, every risk and argument felt small compared to the hum of life in her belly. They headed out of the hospital into the late afternoon sunlight, the sky a brilliant canvas of oranges and pinks. People bustled around them, some limping in with injuries, others walking out with newborns. It felt as though the entire spectrum of life was on display. Sophie inhaled the cool air, turning to Daniel with a soft smile. "We have a lot of work ahead," she said quietly, "but I'm ready to try." He nodded, then surprised her by leaning in to kiss her forehead. Gentle, affectionate. "Me too," he replied. "Nothing else matters more than what we're building. We'll protect it, no matter what." They stepped off the curb, crossing the parking lot hand in hand. The sun hit them at just the right angle, a radiant glow framing their silhouettes. Sophie squeezed his fingers, marveling at how different this felt from all those lonely days of misunderstandings and half-truths. Now, she could see a future built on fragile but authentic honesty, supported by a love that had survived betrayal and chaos. As they reached the car, Daniel smiled at her, eyes warm. "Ready?" he asked, popping the lock. She opened the passenger door, pausing to glance over at him. A surge of gratitude and affection made her heart flutter. This was their moment, and though the journey would continue, with financial hurdles, in-law dramas, restless board members, and sleepless nights once the twins arrived, she finally felt they were facing it together. Sophie and Daniel step out of the hospital hand in hand, feeling the warm sunlight on their faces. Her eyes shine as she turns to him, heart full of renewed hope. He murmurs, "Let's go home. Together."
If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.